first national online lecture series. Today's keynote speaker, Ms. Mumtaz S. Bhalla, advocate on record, the Supreme Court of India, and currently partner at LNL Partners Chamber. Head of the Department and Principal of Law College Dehradun, Dr. Poonam Rawat, also holding the charge of chairperson of this prestigious Moot Court Society. President of the society, Ms. Anna Anupriya, Vice President, Mohammad Danish, Convener, Rahul Kumar Sharma, and today's host, and I see the arranging everything, Secretary of the Society, Ms. Gauri Agrawal. Dear participants, and all the members of office bearers also of LCD MCS, I take this opportunity to extend my greetings to all of you. And also I'm taking this opportunity, rather it's my proud privilege to welcome today's guest speaker, Ms. Mumtaz S. Bhalla. You are welcome, ma'am, in this webinar.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bahuguna. It's indeed a pleasure.
Thank you so much. In fact, let me share with you, starting this online lecture series, we have a specific vision in our mind. We believe that there is a prescribed syllabus of law, and we study it. But we all know law is for the society, and the character of society is dynamic. So law has to be dynamic in nature. When I say dynamic, rapid changes take place with the passage of time in the society, as well as obviously in the law also. The changes may be by the legislature or by the interpretation or ruling of the Apex Court, Commission, and all those who are authorized to give their rulings. Now we all are always at a juncture when there are certain portion of law which in fact we sometimes never come across during our study in schools, law schools or law colleges. So we believe that this lesser discussed portion of law should be covered up with the first-hand knowledge from the experts, like we have today with us Ms. Mumtaz ji. They have practical knowledge, practicing in Delhi area. So this is one of the vision behind starting this series from this year on. Now, today's topic, I'm very happy, is ADR, and this is one of the topic, although we have taken it in the syllabus of law courses as prescribed by Bar Council of India. But reality is that it's a practical paper and most of the students are not taking it seriously. And irrespective of the fact that I believe that next is the era of ADR practice. As you may be surprised, or some of you may knowing that in the country like America, 97% cases are being settled outside the court. So with this scenario, I'm not taking much of the time, Once again, I welcome you, Ms. Mumtaz ji, and I invite you to start your presentation. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Once again, thank you, Dr. Bahuguna, and I would also like to thank the Faculty of Law of Uttaranchal University Law School of Dehradun. These are testing times for all of us, and it's really nice to see that virtual education is encouraged and practical hands-on knowledge being imparted to students at the right time is also encouraged. So I remember when I was back in law school, we used to get faculties. I was from Amity Law School, which is a part of Guru Gobind Singh Indraprasth University. In fact, it's not anymore. It was till last year. So our knowledge was pretty much whatever we were taught in classes, and we used to get faculty from DU to teach us and give us, a more practical experience. But it was very, very rare. And when we entered the field, or when we used to do our internships, we used to realize that it's quite different from it's written in the books. So we all know that whether it's a doctor's course or it's a CA's course or it's law, although these are courses, educational courses, but these are more of professions that we all pursue, and often what is written in the books is quite different from what is there actually in the courts. So it's a good initiative, and I would like to thank the university and the law school, especially Rahul, who reached out to me, and obviously Dr. Bhauguna, who gave his consent to get me on board, because I would be happy to guide kids wherever possible. So I would just start by saying that law as a business or law as a profession is often something we really debate from time to time. And it started off as a profession, but it's taken the tone of a business with more corporate structures coming in, with law firms coming in. And the main function of law as a society, as Sir said, was to keep the society and law and order in place. And the society is changing its dynamics. So since the society changes, the laws will also keep changing. I'm going to primarily focus on the basics of ADR today, but I'll also explain you how the ADR systems have also undergone a change because of the needs of the society. So lawyers play a very important role in very important role in maintenance and restoration of law and order in the society, because we are a part of the justice system. So whenever I step in courts, the first thing on my mind is I'm an officer of the court first. I'm not my client's lawyer. I'm an officer of the court. So I have to conduct myself in a way where I assist the court in whatever the rightful method is, and what the right endeavor is to be achieved. Now, if we come to dispute resolution, we know India is a litigious country. Indians love to litigate. So it's no more a threatening tactic that where people get in and say, "Oh, I'll see you in court. I'll see you in court." The first thing on somebody's mind when we enter into a contract is, "Okay, this. You need to do this. I need to do this." But when something, the smallest of thing comes up, nobody is ready to settle any dispute, and the first line that everyone throws at the other person is, "I'll see you in court." And with a country of over 130 crore people, just imagine the pendency of cases in court. So India has always wanted to be a commercial hub. They've always wanted to attract itself as a big commercial market, because labor is cheaper than all the Western countries. Yeah, I'm not comparing it with Asia. Yes, if you go in Asia, you get much cheaper labor also in certain countries. But if you talk across the globe, our manufacturing capabilities and our contract performance capabilities are quite high. But India has always lacked as a primary destination to attract big contracts, is because of India's litigious nature. Whenever there's a dispute, any foreign party wanting to enter into a contract with an Indian party is very reluctant because of interference by courts, even when there's a alternate dispute resolution mechanism, or whenever there's any contract performance by the other party, by an Indian party. An Indian party is often not reluctant to not perform its part despite the other party performing its part, because their mindset that, okay, we'll see, we'll get to court. Oh, I have to invest X rupees today. If I go to court after 1 year, and I settle it there, I will have to invest X plus 1, but the returns I would get on this X amount, delaying it in that period of 1 year, will be X plus 5. So India had actually lost a lot of credibility because of that. And India also had to keep pace with international norms, where parties, knowing the nature of time consuming litigations in India, obviously across the world also they are time consuming, but India, they are extremely time consuming. You know, there are so many cases which are going on for years and years. The parties die, the legal heirs come in, cases are going on. So to give more sanctity to commercial relations or family settlements, um, people had started bringing in a concept of alternate dispute resolution of arbitration, conciliation, and mediation. So the most used format of alternate dispute resolution is, actually there are two. One is arbitration and one is mediation. So both are at different stages. You have a pre-arbitration mediation possibility. You have a post litigation mediation possibility. I'll come to the mediation part of it later, because to be honest, arbitration is the hot topic. It's the hot topic not today. It's been the hot topic for almost 2 decades now, and I see it to be another, a hot topic for the next 2 decades as well. With a slight competition from IBC. That's how I see it. So, arbitration as a concept is a process where two parties who are contracting into a commercial contract, they decide that our disputes are going to be decided by a third party of our choice. Now, how is that third party selected? What is the manner of choice? I will come to later. I'll just tell you the basics of how an arbitration operates. Now, you can't go in for an arbitration for any and everything. An arbitration will only and only be available in a right, it's available in a right of personam, which is your personal right. It will never be available in a right of rem, which operates against the whole world. So today I cannot go and enter into a contract with someone for any contract of any nature where the repercussions are going to operate against the whole world. But I can definitely enter into a contract against a third party where the repercussions or the effects are going to be only on me. So arbitration will be possible only when there is a right in personam, which is my personal right. If anyway there is a right in rem involved, I will also distinguish how a right in rem comes in place in one contract. So whenever there's a right in rem involved, you have to go to a public fora, which is a court. So I'll give you a small example. If there is a commercial contract for supply of, say, iron ore. So two parties enter into a contract, you have to ship iron ore, there are payment terms, iron ore is shipped, but it's a huge contract of, say, 40 crores. And obviously, whenever there's a commercial contract negotiated where advance payment has to be made, there are securities provided. Securities are provided to secure the money. So there is a shipping contract. I have to send a shipment of iron ore to China, and I insist on an advance payment of 40 crores. The other side will pay me up most of the part of 40 crores, about 36, 37 crores, so that entire consignment money in advance. But what happens to the security of the other side if I send substandard material, or if the material is not cleared by customs? So in such cases, what happens is, people usually give collateral security in form of mortgage documents or a bank guarantee, things like these. So I will come to since I want to explain you the difference between a right in rem and right in personam, I would come to a contract where there's a mortgage document given. So there is a iron ore contract. There is a mortgage document given by the buyer saying that, okay, by the seller saying that, okay, you send me the entire money in advance, and I will give you these documents in case you don't get your shipment, you can use these documents. And if you get your shipment, you return these documents. There is an arbitration clause, arbitration to be presided over by a tribunal comprising of 3 arbitrators. Now, any sane person would say, oh, he's not paid you the money. What is the remedy you have? So a lawyer would often advise invoke arbitration and seek recovery of your money. Now, if a lawyer is to advise, if the client says, what about these mortgage documents? What do I do about these mortgage documents? Why don't I build pressure through these mortgage documents on the other party? So ideally, I don't know how many lawyers would try and figure it out, but anyone who's practicing on the arbitration side would understand that a foreclosure of a mortgage, despite there being an arbitration clause, would not be possible through a tribunal. Because when you foreclose a mortgage by deposit of title deeds, you are changing the nature and the nature of the title documents. And the nature of the title document means you're changing the ownership of the property. When you change the ownership of a property or you create a charge, it's a right which operates against the whole world. Because I am not becoming, when I'm a mortgagee or a mortgagee, and I get ownership or a charge created on a mortgage, I don't get it only against that person. I get it against the whole world. In the eyes of the whole world, I am the owner now. That person is not the owner anymore. So a private tribunal will not be competent to determine such a dispute. Wherever I have to establish my right against the whole world, where I say, I am the owner, boss, none of you are, I will have to go to a public fora. But if there's an inter se issue that, okay, this is a device purchased by me, I own it, you don't own it. So I don't operate against the whole world. I operated against the person who sold it to me. So I can go in arbitration. So an arbitration is a contract where two parties by their own choice decide to have their disputes at a future date resolved by way through a particular entity or a person or a group of persons. Now, to have a valid arbitration, you need to have an arbitration agreement. If you see the Arbitration and Conciliation Act, it doesn't talk about any form and format of an agreement, but it definitely envisages that the agreement has to be in writing. So unlike the civil law where parties can enter into an agreement even orally, an arbitration agreement will definitely have to be reduced in writing. It can be a one-line agreement, it can be a four-line agreement, or it can be a paragraph, but it has to be reduced in writing. It does not lie in the mouth of a party to argue that, oh, we had an arbitration agreement, we orally agreed that X is going to be an arbitrator. Because when you try and give a personal touch to a contract and a method of dispute resolution, you need to be sure that at least the principle and the core terms are reduced in writing. So once there is an arbitration agreement and a party wants to seek resolution of disputes through an arbitration, they have to follow the gamut of procedure envisaged under the agreement as well as the act. Now, there are a lot of kind of agreements. So there are agreements of a sole arbitrator, there are agreements of a three-member tribunal. What the act envisages is you can agree on any number, but the number should not be even. The idea behind this is that there should be a majority view. If you have four arbitrators and 2-on-2, there can be a possibility that you have a 3-on-1 verdict, but there is also a possibility of 2-on-2 verdict. And there can be no judgment out of a 50-50% verdict. You have to have a majority of a verdict. So if you see the scheme of the act, it doesn't talk about the number. It says you can have sole, you can have any number, but it should not be an even number. Now, in practice, what usually happens is, if there are smaller contracts, parties usually opt for a sole arbitrator to be mutually decided by the parties. And if it's a big contract or it's a commercial contract, parties go in for a three-member tribunal. Rarely, very, very rarely, you will find a 5-member tribunal or a 7-member tribunal. So I've been working for almost 13 years now, 12 years. I haven't come across one arbitration where there's a mayor tribunal of more than 3 members. I'll tell you the reasons for that also. But let me first explain about the sole arbitrator. So now there are two parties, A and B, they enter into a contract, and there's an arbitration agreement saying that in case of a dispute, the parties can appoint a sole arbitrator by a mutual consent. Now, prior to 2019, there used to be a condition where often there was an arbitration clause saying, this was very often in government contracts, very, very often. Parties used to say, when there's a government tender or a government contract, a commercial party has got very, very less right to negotiate a contract. A business contract, to the contrary, can be easily negotiated that these are my terms, these are your terms, let's bridge the gap and let's enter into a contract. But when somebody wants a government contract, they often don't have any negotiating power. And the biggest clause in any PSU contract or any government tender used to be that in case of a dispute, you will escalate it to the management of the government company or the PSU, and in case of no resolution, it is to be decided by an arbitration presided over by a sole arbitrator appointed by the MD of the PSU or the company. Now, there are two facets to this. One is the pre-arbitration friendly discussion clause. Now, you would often see parties saying that, oh, there's a clause which says you have to escalate it to the management. It's okay. I've written an email. It's done. No. When there is a friendly discussion clause in an arbitration contract, to be very, very safe, if this is a provision mentioned to follow the gamut of procedure, you have to send a notice of friendly discussions. Whether the other side agrees to it or they don't, it's their problem. You have to follow the gamut of procedure so that the invocation of arbitration is not illegal. That's the first point. Second point comes in about the appointment through the MD. Now, if I'm the MD of a government company and I have to appoint a sole arbitrator in a dispute of my company against a third party, I may be a conscientious person deciding to go very ethically and appoint a neutral person. But there is a small element of doubt that I may choose someone known to me, and that's someone over whom I have a control. Now, if that person is to adjudicate an arbitration against my company, even if I may not tell him to do something for me in my favor, he may just eventually go and decide in my favor to impress me or to please me or do anything. He may do it, he may not do it. But principles of natural justice envisage that there should not be actual bias, there should be a reasonable apprehension of bias. Despite the principles of natural justice clearly laying it down, this practice of a sole arbitrator appointment by the MD of a company has been in place since decades altogether till the year 2019. And it used to be a very helpless and a precarious situation for all the private companies where they were in a dispute against a company, they were being adjudicated upon by a person appointed by the same company, and it was just one person. If it was a tribunal of three, one could still understand that, okay, the person had a right to have a second arbitrator appointed. So a case was filed in Supreme Court last year. It's called Perkins. You guys can look it up, Perkins Supreme Court. It came up, I think, in November 2019, somewhere around 25th, 26th November 2019. That judgment said, so our Arbitration Act underwent a major change in 2015 to bring in the IBA rules of evidence and to bring the conflict of law principles within the Arbitration Act. When this case was filed, the basic argument taken in this case was, where is the fairness? How do you give effect to the 2015 amendment where there is a specific provision to challenge the bias of an arbitrator? And the Supreme Court went on to say, such contracts where the arbitrator so appointed has, or the authority appointing the arbitrator has any kind of interest in the outcome of arbitration, such an arbitration appointment mechanism will be invalid. You have to go to court for an appointment. So this was one change in the sole arbitrator system. Now, there is a 3-member tribunal. The purpose behind this is party A appoints one member, party B appoints one member. The two arbitrators get together and appoint a third member. There appears to be an element of fairness because you are putting your nominee before the forum. In the forum, the other party is putting their nominee in the forum. The two nominees together are appointing a third one who's presiding over the arbitration. Usually what happens in a 3-member arbitration tribunal is when there's a dispute, the claimant invokes arbitration, but the other side often, does not appoint another arbitrator. This is also a problem in cases of an appointment of a sole arbitrator. So you'll invoke arbitration. You'll send a notice for invocation of arbitration. What happens is there are mixed clauses also. There are clauses which say that you can have an arbitration presided over by a sole arbitrator to be mutually decided by the parties. But in cases of failure to agree on a mutual sole appointment, it is to be adjudicated by a tribunal comprising of 3 members. So The first step to commence an arbitration is sending a notice for invocation of arbitration. You cannot straight away invoke arbitration by filing a statement of claim. You have to send a notice telling the party that this is the dispute. So, you know, availability of a dispute and notice for invocation of arbitration. They are sine qua non because you have to tell the party disputes have arisen before us, between us. We've been unable to resolve these disputes. I want to invoke arbitration. X is my nominee. X is my suggestion as a sole arbitrator, but in case you don't agree with him, please consider him to be my nominee in a 3-member tribunal. What the other party will do is, so I may be suggesting the most ethical person on this planet. In actual parlance and in common practice, the other side will never agree. They will never agree as a practice because they will be of a view, oh, the claimant is suggesting it, the claimant will have some links, I'm not agreeing to it. Whether there are links or not, nobody cares. They will reject that nomination. They will make their own suggestion and say that in case you agree to my suggestion as a sole arbitrator, good. Otherwise, please consider him to be my nominee. So this is the way how tribunals usually come and get constituted. Both the nominees then get together and appoint a third arbitrator. Now, in case one party fails to appoint and they say that no, there is no dispute, there is no requirement for an arbitration, what the claimant often does is they file a Section 11 application in court, which in cases of a domestic arbitration usually goes to a high court or any court of an original jurisdiction. Since I'm in Delhi, Delhi has got original site jurisdiction. So there are 4 courts in India which have got original site jurisdiction of such a nature in a commercial court. They will file a Section 11 application. At the stage of Section 11 application, the court will see if there is an arbitration agreement and there is a dispute. They will appoint an arbitrator and refer the parties to arbitration. Now, the 1940 Act and the 1996 Act were totally different on the concept of umpire. What has been relevant and prevalent in at least our era is the 1996 Act. 1996 Act had certain principles where there was an arbitration agreement. Arbitration could be invoked by either parties under the contract. People went to court in Section 11. And there was a concept of international commercial arbitration where, under a Section 9 petition. So I'll have to explain you guys what Section 9 is. So let me come to Section 9 first, and I'll explain you the difference that BALCO brought in, and then the 2015 amendment, and then the 2019 amendment. So what happened was, so if there's a dispute, supposing I gave you the shipping and iron ore example. So in case the shipment has gone to a port in say Singapore, I'm not saying China consciously. So I'll say Singapore. It's lying at the Singapore port. The other party inspects it and says, no, it's not the quality I ordered for. I'm not accepting it. It keeps lying there. It attracts demurrage, attracts custom duty, and the goods also are at a risk of perishing. Now, by the time your tribunal will be constituted, it will be another 2.5, 3 months because you have to give a notice. The notice will have a time period given for appointment of an arbitrator. If the other side gives a counter notice, you have to follow the procedure. It is a 2-3 months process, but keeping in view the imminent damage to your goods and the fact that you're incurring daily demurrage, you need an urgent relief. You've signed up for an arbitration. India does not recognize emergency arbitrations at all. What do you do if it's an international commercial law arbitration seated in India? What do? You file a Section 9 petition in court. You tell the court that, see, yes, there is an arbitration agreement. Yes, we have decided to go into arbitration, but I need an urgent relief right now. I need an injunction. I need an order. Please give me an order to protect myself. In such a cases, earlier, the courts used to have a power. So I'll tell you how they changed from the Act to BALCO to now. So often the courts, involved themselves and came in and saying, no, we are going to give a Section 9 relief. Why? Because it's an urgent requirement. And the difference between a Section 9 relief and an arbitration is, in an arbitration, you can just bind the parties. That's it. You cannot bind any other party, any other person, any other entity. In a Section 9 relief, you can even bind third parties because the court has got wider powers than an arbitration tribunal. An arbitral tribunal is a creature of a contract, but courts are creature of a law. So their powers are wider. They can pass an order which will bind the port authorities also, which will bind the custom authorities also. So their order will prevail over every other authority. This practice was really looked down upon by the international community. Really looked down upon. They said it defeats the purpose of an arbitration, and this practice was usually, um, you know, invoked for a bank guarantee. So there were commercial contracts, bank guarantees were given by banks which are situated in India. And whenever there was a contractual issue and the party invoked a bank guarantee, an Indian party used to come to court and file a Section 9 petition seeking injunction against the bank guarantee. Now, law on bank guarantee is also clear that it's a separate contract. It's not a part of the main contract of arbitration. Despite that, if the bank guarantee was, uh, you know, when it was conditional, yes, we agree that there could be a stay. Even when the bank guarantee was unconditional, there were so many cases where the court, under a Section 9 petition, used to, injunct invocation and encashment of a bank guarantee. This really deterred the parties from coming to India as a practice. So in Balco, the court went on to, apart from the issue on seat and venue, the court went on to say that, you know, this will not apply. And the government was really not happy with it. And ours is a very pro Indian manufacturing unit government and pro Indian banking unit government. So to get these powers back to them, they got in the latest amendment, which says unless the parties in an international commercial arbitration specifically exclude applicability of Part 1, some sections of Part 1, in which the major section, the applicable major point is Section 9 only, Section 9 of the Act. Others are rarely used. It will apply even to an international commercial arbitration seated outside of India. So now, if I have an arbitration with a party in Singapore, which is Singapore seated, but because I am an Indian party or there is an Indian element. So international commercial arbitration is an arbitration where at least one party is a foreign party. But it does not mean that there has to be an Indian party or not. It usually has an Indian party and a foreign party, but it can also have, more than one foreign party. So it can be between one Indian party and two foreign parties, or between one Indian party and five foreign parties. It just says where one of the parties, if you see the definition under the Act, it just says where one of the parties is not Indian. Now imagine a situation, a contract which is performed in Singapore, it's seated in Singapore, Curia law is Singapore, substantive procedure, all laws of Singapore. But the Indian party has given a bank guarantee of a bank in India. Invoked in Singapore. And the Indian party comes here and files a Section 9 petition in the court here, in Supreme Court. How unfair it is on the other party. But since there is an Indian ramification, our principle of cause of action, that because the party is here, the bank guarantee is given of a bank here, Section 9 will apply. Now, if the parties don't want any Indian interference, under the new Act, they have to specifically exclude it in their arbitration agreement in the contract at the time of entering into the contract. It's a very important point. So it's not something that is being thrust upon people. You have a choice, but you need to exercise that choice judiciously at the time of entering into a contract. Now, another difference between, so there is a difference between a domestic arbitration and an international commercial arbitration. Till Balco, there was a lot of confusion on the issue of what is a seat, what is the venue. Seat used to be a place of which it had actually no relevance in a domestic law in a place like India, because we don't have different laws across the country. But in a place like US, it could have been relevant because every state of US follows a different law. But in India, in essentially in cases of a domestic arbitration, a seat meant Indian law. Simple. If you keep it very simple, if I explain it to you in layman's language for as a as a teacher to a student, it meant the place from where the law would apply. So Balco said your seat will never change, your venue can change. So I could have an Indian seated domestic arbitration, which is Bombay seated or Delhi seated, but Delhi and Bombay have no law differences unless there is a procedural law difference, that how a law will operate in Bombay and how it will operate in Delhi. So I'll give an example of that in a rent and tenancy agreement. So venue could change. So the tribunal had a power to say that yes, this arbitration is Bombay seated, but because all the three arbitrators are situated at Delhi, we want to hold the hearings at Delhi. It did not mean a shift of the seat at all. But this kind of an issue could often create a complication in an international arbitration, because if it's an so assuming it's an English seated arbitration out of London and it's an international commercial arbitration. Question was, could the parties have a hearing in India? Answer is yes. People often lawyers had argued that no, when you shift it from London to India, you're changing the seat. And the court said no, you are just changing the venue of arbitration. You're not changing the seat at all. The seat remains to be London. You will apply English law. So if I put it very simple, seat means law, substantive law of the place. You can, in an arbitration agreement, the substantive law governing the arbitration can be different and the procedural law governing the arbitration can be different. So I can enter into an arbitration agreement where the substantive law is Indian law, but the procedural law is IBA rules of evidence instead of the Indian Evidence Act. So I cannot insist on Indian substantive law applying. Yes, Indian Evidence Act will apply only of the substantive provisions, but the procedural law will purely be IBA rules of evidence. I will not be able to get in my Indian law in that. So that's one part of it. The second part of it is how to conduct the hearings. Now, why arbitration as an alternate dispute resolution mechanism as opposed to court? It's quicker. If you go to a court, at times the date you get is after 4 months. But if you choose a tribunal of your choice, you can get an arbitration concluded in 4 months. There were challenges to this also. There were arbitrations going on for 5, 10 years. So India had also lost credibility as an arbitration destination, because of which the 2015 amendment came in, where the parliament, the legislature decided that any arbitration commenced post October 2014 will have to be concluded and an award passed within 1 year of the arbitration. This was a breathtaking step. 1 year, a party may say, is a small time, but it's a very big time for a private party to adjudicate on your disputes. When this law was passed, it sought to restore faith in the arbitration system in India within the international community. So I still remember when we used to market ourselves as a good arbitration destination, as an alternate dispute resolution destination, a preferred destination for arbitration in Asia, for it being not just being in parity with the common law and having elements of codified laws, but also because of its cost, its location, and all these aspects. So the biggest selling point we had was, now we have this law. This is going to get finished in 1 year. But did it get finished in 1 year? Answer is no. I think in about 12, 13 arbitrations that I did between 2015 and 19, or maybe more, the domestic ones, every arbitration was extended, but it was a welcome step. Earlier, the arbitrations used to go on. So there is an arbitration I'm doing which is on from 2009. It's still on. It's still going on. I'm in 2020 now. It's been 11 years. It's a builder and a buyer dispute. It's 11 years. Arbitration is on. The judge is hearing matter day after day, day after day. It's going on. If you compare to that, yes, it was a welcome step because the act says parties by consent can extend the time for tribunal for adjudication of disputes by 6 months. After 6 months, they have to go to court under 29A. So initially, the courts also understood that there is an arbitration which could be, this small, but there could be a big arbitration in an EPC contract, which is an engineering, procurement, and construction contract, or a BOT contract, which is a build, operate, and transfer contract, or a a VOCPT contract. So these kind of contracts have recurring documents exchanged every day. So if you see the volume of documents, there's one arbitration in which we had 35,000 pages to read to prepare the statement of claim. Now, 4 weeks is not enough time for me to prepare a statement of claim reading 35,000 pages. I definitely need 8 weeks. So courts decided that, okay, there are some cases where one may need time. They decided to extend the time period by another 3 to 6 months, depending on the need. That was also a welcome step because this extension of time for another 6 months and 6 months by the parties eventually led to an award coming within 2 years. 2 years is a very, very good time in the Indian market to get an award. I'm telling you very honestly with practical experience. But then the legislature understood that the delay was not due to hearing hearing the matter by the tribunal. It was often because of completion of pleadings. Statement of claim took time, defense took time, discoveries took time. So they further amended the law to say that you will get 6 months to complete your pleadings. Then you have 1 year after completion of pleadings to complete the arbitration. So the law is also evolving as per requirements of the society. Now, if we come through the procedures, why again arbitration is a preferred method is because if you have to lead evidence in court, you will go for one hearing. The judge may be on leave. The other side will not be ready. The reader will not be available. There are a lot of practical challenges to have an effective hearing. If it's an alternate dispute resolution mechanism in form of an arbitration, you can decide a prefix date. A party can be sitting in Chennai, and you can have a video conference. You can have a transcriptor or a steno here. The tribunal needs to be here. Evidence can be recorded. So it's quick. It's expeditious. Yes, arbitrations are not that cheap anymore, but the scheme of the act was to make it inexpensive and expeditious, which is why we have DIC rules, we have MCI, which are cheaper alternatives. The procedure became flexible and it became whatever the tribunal wanted to do. Yes, the tribunal had to keep the larger interest of principles of law in mind, but they were not bound by any law. So the invocation, the procedure, the hearing. So when an award comes, if there's an arbitration award which comes, it is binding on the parties. If it's a litigation, as opposed to this, if there's a litigation, you have a method to appeal. If there's a recovery suit, there's an order against you, you file a first appeal, you file a second appeal. You have so many remedies. An arbitration award is binding and final. Why? Because you decided to trust the judgment of a third person and you gave this right of judgment to a third person. You have to go by judgment. An arbitration award can only be challenged under Section 34, not as a measure of appeal, but on very limited grounds. But in practicality, do you think it's not filed as an appeal? Answer is no. There is a clause in Section 34 which says an arbitration agreement can be challenged if it is against the public policy of India. Now, what is public policy? Public policy means it is against the scheme of the legal system in India. But what do parties do? Oh, there's an award against me. Make two legal points. Because this finding is contrary to section so and so of the act. It is against the provision of law of India. It is against the public policy of India. So despite the act not providing an option to file an appeal and just challenge the order under 34 on very restrictive grounds, it's been practically challenged almost every second time. So when as kids, when you do a research or you do a project and you read judgments, you'll be like, I am unable to understand what is the difference between public policy and a normal appeal. Which is why I'm trying to explain you that don't get confused. When you research, you will see what the basic principles are. It's just Associated Builders is the name of the judgment, which explains what are the cases in which Section 34 petition can be filed in the court. But if you see a very fact-oriented case, that, oh, these are factual findings, but still the court has gone on to say it is against the public policy, you need to understand that it's been worded so cleverly to fall as a challenge to the law in India. It doesn't change the law. It's a perception that it has changed. It's become factual. It may be, you may at best say it's not a good judgment, but the law still remains the same. We need to understand how the scheme of law is different from practical applicability. So today, if I'm doing an arbitration, I don't have to get disappointed that Section 34 says, oh, it's supposed to be against public policy, but oh, I went to court. This the judge passed an order saying that this is against public policy, but it's a simple appeal. Yes, it's a simple appeal, but that's how the law is operating and interpreted by courts today. There's very little you can do about it. Then comes in the issue of mediation. Now, mediation is a better method, but a weaker method which is not that binding. So mediation can become a more effective method if you try to bring it in form of a MEDAB, a mediation arbitration, where a mediator mediates your disputes, and if the disputes don't work out, the same mediator decides to carry on as an arbitration. That's MEDAB. The concept is not really accepted in India right now, but I think we are moving towards it slowly. But mediation as an alternate dispute resolution is very, very prevalent in divorce cases, matrimony, any kind of matrimonial issue, any kind of family issues, family settlement issues. So there is a big conglomerate. The head of the conglomerate or the karta of the HUF dies, and there's a family settlement. There are issues. In such cases, usually issues are more ego-driven than legal. And if you are to sit in court to seek resolution of such a dispute, it will take forever. So mediation is a preferred method where you can get in a person either appointed by a court whom you have reasons to believe is fair, or a person. So mediation, you can even get a person of your choice. The only point relevant here is the lack of sanctity. So unless I agree to something in the mediation, you cannot bind me by it. Yes, the mediator can give a report saying I was unrelenting, but so I was. Yes, I have a right under law. I'm unrelenting. I'm not going to relent. But that does not mean that you can give a finding against me. You have to still go through the four corners of law to give a finding against me. So mediation is usually used to assuage egos, concerns. So if you see a matrimonial case, often parties come up and file, oh, you slapped me, I'm going to file a domestic violence case against you. Oh, you filed a domestic violence case against me, now so I'm going to file a divorce against you. So with a small slap, there are 5 legal cases. Now, none of the parties intend to go through the whole process of those 5 cases in the next 20 years, because everyone wants to give a closure either this way or that way. They want to give it a closure and they want to move on, either forward, or nobody wants to go back. So they move forward either together or separately. In such cases, court often, especially trial courts, they often refer to mediation by an expert mediator to mediate the issues between the parties and explain that, see, these are the issues. If this is the way you go about it, you both can be happy. But again, the mediator cannot compel anything. They can just guide. What is important is who to be a good mediator. Do you want a lawyer as a mediator, or do you want, a normal, a specialized person as a mediator? In a commercial contract, ideally there should not be a lawyer, because lawyers often get very technical in their mediations. Oh, no, I'm not negotiating on this. Law says this, law says that. But if we get a commercial mind will obviously give a more, or probably a CA. He'll say, oh, if you do this, this is the return you have. If you do this, this is the return you have. The gap is too small. But if you litigate, you also make it uncertain, and the gap also widens because you have a legal fees, you have unwanted expenses, and you have uncertainty. So If you want to choose a mediator, you always choose the right person. That either makes your mediation go through or it totally brings it down. But if you want a family settlement, would you want to have a family relative or a known person as a mediator? Answer is no, because parties are never going to believe on anyone. You need to have a specialized person who can explain the parties of their rights and obligations and the effect of the mediation and the effect of not going in for the mediation and getting going the court route. So while mediation is very, very widely exercised in matters of family, mainly family, I have only seen them in family. Yes, they've been widely included in commercial disputes also by way of that friendly discussion clause or escalation to the management clause. But the lack of sanctity really in a commercial contract doesn't, it deters the party from proceeding with it. So a mediation in a commercial contract is often a formality, but they are definitely taken seriously in matrimonial and family issues, family settlement and issues like that. Now, there is also a concept of conciliation under the Arbitration and Conciliation Act. It has an element of bindingness, but it's never exercised in practicality. Nobody wants to go into a conciliation or a conciliator. I have personally failed to understand why. It's a very good method. It's a very practicable method. It's never been exercised, at least in my professional experience. And I can assure you, I have done a lot of commercial work and a lot of civil work on the civil side. Even in my research, I haven't come across one conciliatory case, at least on the kind of matters I've been working on. So a lot of laws come up on paper, but they are rarely used in practicality. Our approach in courts and our approach in real life is quite different. It it actually depends on the parties, because when two parties contract with each other, they may have a different mindset when they enter into a contract because everything is like a happy family. But when disputes come up, the first thing they want to do is kill your own family member. Oh no, I'm not. I'm going to go to court. I'm going to go to arbitration. I've seen so many times a party comes to us and says, "Oh, it's a commercial dispute, but I want to see if you can bring in a criminal angle." And our answer is no, boss. It's a civil dispute. We are going to keep it as a civil dispute because we don't want to bring in a criminal angle to file something which we will not be able to sustain tomorrow. Yes, a police complaint may be filed, maybe an FIR is also registered, but what is the ultimate result? So parties are usually keen to have a more aggressive strategy in place to get their work done, which is why amongst the three methods of alternate dispute resolution, arbitration is the most preferred method. With the new act, because this is the one point I missed, so that you guys can hit me up with questions. I can't cover up everything in 1 hour, but I've tried to cover up the basics of everything. You guys can hit me up with all the questions you have. The new act has also sought to bring in, it's not been notified yet. So it's not the law anymore. It will come in someday, but not as of today, because the 2019 amendment, these sections have been passed, but it's not been notified yet. So they realized that usually if arbitration was supposed to be inexpensive and quick, so it ideally had to be that in an arbitration between two entities in the market, that area that I live in, they could just choose me as an arbitrator and I could give a finding quickly. Now this never happened. There was a increasing habit of getting a high court or a Supreme Court judge as an arbitrator. And if any party got a Supreme Court, a Supreme Court judge as an arbitrator, the other side had to get a Supreme Court judge, because there was tension in the mind that if I get a lawyer or a non-judge or a high court judge or obviously retired judges or a trial court judge, the Supreme Court judge will have precedence being a senior, because he will always be the senior member of the tribunal. And in cases of a 3-member tribunal, sole is okay. Anyways, it's in cases of a 3-member tribunal, if one arbitrator is a retired district judge and the other arbitrator is a Supreme Court judge, the presiding arbitrator as a practice is not somebody lesser than a Supreme Court judge. You have to have the presiding arbitrator has to be in respect senior to someone who's already an arbitrator. So this practice led to all the judges getting busy, their diaries not being free, dates in arbitration being given after six months, arbitrations hanging on for years and years. Despite the amendment, the arbitrators were still full in their diaries and there was no effective hearing. matters were adjourned. See, the idea is if you have an arbitration abroad, they finish an arbitration in 3 months. Because if I'm an arbitrator, I will take up only 3 arbitrations in 3 months if I can. In India, there's an increasing practice of overdoing it. One arbitrator will take up 100 arbitrations. How do you do it? How do you do 100 arbitrations? So the government has amended the act further, but it's not notified yet to actually have an institutional process where there'll be an arbitration council which will designate institutions in all jurisdictions. Where institutions are not available, they will designate individuals. Such institutions designated, the arbitration council designated institutions, they will be registered with the council and designated by the court. These double verified institutions will have the power to appoint an arbitrator in a Section 11 application. So an application will not go to court. It will go to these institutions for appointment, like it is abroad. If you have LCIS, so there you always decide it as a contract, but here the act will give you a power. Once it's notified, I think it should be a welcome step. But if you see the composition of the arbitration council, it again is very narrow. So I don't know how much of an objective will be achieved from it. But let's see. It's not seen the light of the day. When it does, we will see, and we'll see how to deal with it. So although arbitration is supposed to be quick, effective, and inexpensive, due to the challenges of it being delayed, it being expensive, it being ineffective, a lot of amendments have been brought in to take care of the fees. The IC rules have been brought in to take care of the timelines. The amendment in 2015 was brought in to take care of the biasness. You can now challenge the appointment of an arbitrator under the act. So a lot of protections have come in to make it achieve the objective of an effective alternate dispute resolution. But we still have a long way to go before we sleep. And if you ask me amongst the best methods of alternate dispute resolution, I would still suggest arbitration as a better method as opposed to mediation. I would actually suggest MEDARB. It should be mediation with arbitration. That would be my personal recommendation. But it actually depends on what the parties are aiming to achieve. So this is the basic of how it works that I could just grapple and tell you in about 45 odd minutes. So I'm sure you guys would have a lot of questions if you've read the law. So I'm happy to take all your questions. So how do I see the questions? Chat. Oh my God. So I'll go from the reverse. How is the doctrine of separability applicable during an arbitration proceeding? Can you elaborate on an instance where separability is invoked in a provision? So this I could have actually explained by, the chloro control principle or the Antariksh judgment or Swastik Industries. So basically an arbitration agreement is a separate agreement. It survives the main contract. Even when the main contract will come to an end, your arbitration agreement will survive. So about the issue of severability and novation or substitution, the terms of contract are often interpreted how they are written in the contract. So if the contract specifically says that any provision which is inconsistent with the other, X will prevail, or in cases of inconsistency, Y will prevail, and provisions are severable, whatever is not enforceable, the others will prevail, they will prevail. The interpretation is not like it is in the constitution, the interpretation is like it is written in the contract. Now, this question brings me to an important point which I wanted to tell you guys. Since arbitration is a creature of a contract, it's only the parties to an arbitration which are governed by an arbitration. So if you want an interim relief, you go to court under Section 9. But if you want an interim relief from a tribunal, you go under Section 19 before a tribunal. But the difference will be the tribunal can only bind the parties, not a third party. So if the bank guarantee example I gave you, a bank guarantee is injuncted by a court. The court can injunct the third party, a bank also. Suppose HDFC Bank. But an arbitral tribunal cannot injunct HDFC because they have no privity of contract with the parties, and they have not signed in to have any kind of a dispute resolved by the tribunal. So what do you do in such a case? The tribunal will injunct one of the parties from invoking or taking steps to encash the bank guarantee. So the injunction will operate against the party which is before the tribunal. The powers in 9 are wider than 17. Second important point was, can you bind a sister company or a group company in an arbitration? So this question came up because there were a lot of EPC contracts where I'm a group company, I'm AB Limited. I'm supplying the material. My sister company, BC Limited, is doing the erection and commissioning. Then there is another company, DE Limited, which is doing the operations and maintenance. Now, when there was a dispute which arose, often there was a composite settlement agreement or a composite revised agreement. So supply is done, erection and commissioning is pending, O&M, operation and management is pending. There is a dispute, parties decide, okay, let's have a third agreement. Party signs to the agreement, but there's no arbitration clause in that. Can you bind such a party? Yes, you can bind such a party if the intention is clear from such an agreement. So the Chloro Control was the landmark decision in this by the Supreme Court, where they said if there is either an incorporation of reference, or there is a group of companies doctrine, or there is specific inclusion of terms of the earlier contract, you can also have a sister, that the supplementary agreement will become a part of the mother agreement, and you can invoke arbitration even against the third party. So I would request you guys to read that judgment of Chloro Control. It's slightly complicated and it's a lengthy judgment. Para 70 onwards is where they discuss the main law. Read the judgment. If you guys have any doubt, I am on LinkedIn. My handle on LinkedIn is Mumtaz Bhalla. Send me your queries. You can take my mail ID from Rahul. It's bmumtaz@luthra.com. Send me your questions, because these judgments are slightly technical, and they are quite different from what is written in the Arbitration and Conciliation Act. Read them. If you have any questions, please mail me your questions. I will be happy to answer them. So that was one principle. What about negotiation? Negotiation is a prerequisite of mediation. Actually not. A negotiation is a prerequisite of a valid contract, but parties can give up their right to negotiate, as I said, but they can't give up their right to negotiate on appointment of an arbitrator. So yeah. Can I move to court in case I'm not satisfied with the mediation but the other parties? Yes, you can, because mediation is not binding. You don't need to go to court. Basically, if you're not, so when a mediation is done, when a mediation order is passed, it is in form of a consent order, and there is no challenge under law against a consent order unless the consent is obtained by fraud. So when a mediation is successful, if you have to sign the order. So in case you're not satisfied with the mediation proceedings and the outcome of mediation, you don't sign the award, and the mediator sends a report to the court saying mediation failed. Is arbitration today a handy choice only for commercial disputes, or an easy option to resolve matters outside commercial sectors too, adding to which you said the process of... Okay, so the question is it handy only for commercial disputes, or is it an easy option to resolve matters outside the commercial sectors too? So I've seen it as a very important tool in cases of a builder-buyer dispute, which is not very commercial. If it's an individual who's dealing with the builder, I've seen it very often being used in a tenancy case. In case of a tenancy, if it's but these are very technical issues. So if there's a tenancy agreement, if there's a rent dispute where non-payment of rent is an issue, you can invoke arbitration. You can put in an arbitration clause. But if what happens when your main agreement, when your rent agreement is a 5-year commercial agreement, but you did not register it and you did not stamp it, can you invoke arbitration? Because the law is, even if the agreement is ineffective, the arbitration agreement will survive it. In such a case, yes, the arbitration agreement will survive, but the tribunal will not have any powers to decide any dispute, because what happens is, if a rent deed is unregistered or unstamped, it becomes a month-to-month tenancy by holding over, because it's a defect under non-registration is a material defect under Section 17 of the Registration Act. So there's a 5-year commercial lease. After 3 years, when the curing period for registration is gone, it cannot be registered. What happens to the lease? The lease is, invalid in the eyes of law. So it's unenforceable. So you become a month-to-month tenant by holding over. But then what happens to the arbitration agreement? Because law is that it will survive the main contract. Yes, it survives. But the arbitral tribunal gets its powers from the contract when the contract itself is not enforceable. What will the tribunal act on? So in that case, you will have to go to court again. So it is a handy process in other proceedings also, but you need to have a technical person or a very competent person to draft such an agreement to make it enforceable. That's the point. So I don't think there are any questions. Is there any other question? Because I could just see the names.
I'll quickly put one question.
Yeah.
There's a question from Avantika. She said that
okay.
Our act started in 1940, then we amended in 1996. Meanwhile, SIAC started in 1991, but it has been more progressive. So what is the reason behind success of SIAC?
See, I'll tell you what. SIAC is not an act. SIAC is an institution. It's Singapore International Arbitration Center. So I can compare the success of SIAC to the DIAC, to MCIA, and the failure of LCIA in India. LCIA India failed miserably. But I can't compare it to the act because SIAC doesn't lay down any substantive law. Our act, so you need to understand the difference between substantive law and procedural law. Substantive law is the law which governs a contract. Okay, in cases of a dispute, which is the law which will apply? Indian Contract Act, English Contract Act, Singapore law, what law? But if you sign up for an institution, the procedural part of the process of conduct of arbitration will be governed under those institutions' rules. So I'll give you an example of SIAC. Now, if you agree to an arbitration under SIAC rules, SIAC has a provision for an emergency arbitration. But what happens when emergency arbitration award is passed against an Indian party? It's not enforceable in India, because if you see section 45 and 48 of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act, there is no provision for enforcing an interim award, because an emergency arbitration award has to go to a regular course of arbitration. So there are a lot of challenges. Why SIAC is successful as an institution is because their rules are very good. I think ICC is still the most successful one. I think SIAC is still comparatively less successful than ICC. But a reason for success of SIAC is the location. That's why I was telling you guys about how India is the preferred choice. The location, the cost, the country neutrality. It's easy for an Australian client and a European client to come into Asia. It's easy for an American client and an Australian client to come into Asia. But if you have to have a London-seated arbitration, it can only be a European issue or Europe and US, which have proximity towards that side. But if you have something towards this side, this is obviously a preferred destination. And with Asia being a commercial hub, maritime arbitrations primarily out of Asian countries. Commercial aspects, because the manufacturing units are mainly in and around Asia. These are reasons why Asia is a hot-selling arbitration destination. People don't take in Hong Kong and China as a preferred destination. People don't take in Dubai. Now, UAE is coming up because of DIAC, Dubai International Arbitration Center, which is at the financial city, which operates as an SEZ. Because Dubai, you have that Muslim law concept, and your decree comes in form of in the name of Allah, and also the enforceability is again an issue. China and Hong Kong, again their law is an issue. So Singapore is, at best a better version of Indian law and a more concise version of American law and with elements of English law. You need to see how how effective or how useful the country as a jurisdiction is. Singapore law is a very neutral law. Singapore as a country is a very neutral country in terms of law. But if you see Chinese law or Hong Kong law or UAE law, they are very, very partial jurisdictions. which is why India is taking on as a big arbitration destination now. We have a good area near the Aerocity to to build an arbitration center. Our law is at best, you know, a primitive form of English law. That's how I can put it. But it's coming up as a good arbitration center. The challenges that I told you about cost, about timelines, were the challenges that parties never chose Indian law as the substantive law. It is to overcome these challenges that the government to induce other parties to come in and choose India as a preferred destination, that these laws have been amended on the advice of Law Commission. So Law Commission had actually also advised emergency arbitration, but our legislature has not accepted that.
Do you feel that emergency arbitration, if adopted, will be a prospective aspect in the arbitration regime of India?
See, I'll tell you what. I think in a place like India, where a party is happy to take an injunction and sit through it, and which brings me to another important amendment. So prior to 2015, a party could take a Section 9 order, interim injunction, and sit forever. No invocation of arbitration ever. Take an injunction, keep sitting on it. So the other party had to go to court. This was also covered under the 2015 amendment, where court said that no, if you get an order under Section 9, you have to invoke arbitration within 90 days. You have no choice. Your injunction will cease to exist after 90 days. So if you ask me about emergency arbitrations, see, honestly, I don't see anyone going in for an emergency arbitration, because an emergency arbitration will often be by a sole arbitrator. I would see them going to courts anyway. So I don't see the prospects too high anyway. I don't see it to be very high, because here Indians are very used to distrusting somebody who's either not appointed by a judicial authority or who's not a judicial authority in itself. So even as a lawyer, so I could be an arbitrator, but do you think anyone is going to believe in me if I'm the sole person deciding a dispute of two parties? The answer is they would always say, no, why her? I have every reason to doubt she's siding with one of the parties. So I don't see it to be a very successful prospect. Plus, the main principle of an emergency arbitration is that you need to serve the other side. Now, you know how services happen in India. You'll put the wrong name, you'll put the wrong address, you'll put a courier receipt, it'll never be delivered. So these are challenges. And when an order is passed, and if a party actually, so the effectiveness of an emergency arbitration procedure under MCI rules in India and DIC rules is parties accept and sign up for it, and they undertake to adhere to it. But what do you do if they don't comply? You can't do nothing. But if they comply with it, and it's an order obtained by fraud, what do you do? So I think in a jurisdiction like ours, I still see people going to court more often. And I know how, like in whatever experience, at least in the courts I've appeared. So I've appeared in Delhi, I've appeared in Hyderabad, I've appeared in Bangalore, Chennai, Calcutta, Bombay, Chandigarh, even Jammu and Kashmir. I have increasingly seen the tendency of choosing the temple and the priest. This court, this senior, this. I don't see the emergency arbitration getting any headway, at least in India. So I personally don't see it, but obviously I'm not no one to give a finding on it. So any more questions, guys?
I don't think we have more questions.
Thank you for your lightning views, ma'am.
It's a pleasure. Thank you. Yeah.
I would request Ms. Anna Anupriya, President, Moot Court Society, to give a vote of thanks.
Sure.
Good evening. So, without taking much time, on behalf of the Moot Court Society, being the president, I would like to give a brief vote of thanks to everyone who made this seminar possible. At the outset, I'd like to thank Ms. Mumtaz Bhalla, who had agreed to lead and kickstart our online lecture series with her words of wisdom and value, helping students like us to learn from the experiences of professionals like her. Moving on, I'd like to thank Professor Dr. Rajesh Bahuguna, Dean Law College, Dehradun, and officiating Vice Chancellor of Uttaranchal University, along with Chairperson of Moot Court Society, Professor Dr. Poonam Rawat ma'am, who always keep encouraging us and always supporting us in organizing events like this. Moot Court Society also thanks Youth Bar Association of India for providing technical support, without which this seminar wouldn't have been possible. And finally, I would like to thank all the participants who have been with us throughout the lecture and who have registered and attended the seminar as well. Thank you.
So I would also like to thank everyone who's organized this, especially Dr. Bahuguna for such kind words and for thinking me worthy of speaking to you guys. Rahul and obviously Anna, who wrote to me about the whole idea, and everyone who's attended, made efforts to attend this and understand. Before I just close in, I would just like to say that I just named about 3 judgments. If anyone who's got interest in arbitration, please read up Chlorocontrol, read up Associated Builders, read up Perkins, and read up SMST. If you guys have any doubt, because these are pretty much what lay down our law. And there is HCC also on bank guarantees, but that can wait for a while. I would not recommend you to read BALCO because it's a very big judgment and you guys are just students. You will get lost in the process, and anyways, it's become redundant now with the new act. So if you have any questions on any alternate dispute resolution, because obviously I do understand the time constraint and my, my time limit to explain the 3 processes, I try to focus on the more prevalent one and the more valid and the more logical one for you guys. But if you have any questions, please reach out to me. I would be more than happy to answer. If there's any doubt on any other law topic also, I'll be more than happy to guide you all. And all the best for your future, and thank you everyone.
And lastly, we congratulate you for clearing the prestigious AOR exam this year.
Thank you. So I didn't even tell anyone that I sat for the exam because I had no time to study at all, and it's an exam you need to study for. I literally gave an application to withdraw my name because I could not study even for 10 days or 7 days or something. So I was told by the registrar that if you withdraw your candidature right now, you will not be able to sit for the exam again, and it's on our discretion. So I said, okay, let me just sit and take the experience, and we'll see how it turns out. And when I did my exam and the marks were also good, I was like, it's not that bad. Yeah, thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
My all the blessings to Mumtaz.
Thank you so much, sir. Really.
Very necessary. I have gone through the entire lecture. Okay.
Thank you so much, sir. I feel really honored.
Even the gray areas which you have covered, 34 and all. I'm very convinced. God bless you, Mumtaz.
Thank you so much, sir. It's indeed an honor to hear such nice words from you. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, ma'am.